Wood is made out of cellulose. Good. Where does cellulose come from? How do plants make cellulose? From? They make it from sunlight. They use the energy of sunlight. They use what? Water and CO2. So plants take water and CO2 and they make wood, right? So that's where most of the biomass comes from. Now, there are some nutrients that are taken out of the soil and used in order to make certain parts of the plant. But most of that biomass comes from water and the carbon from CO2. Does that make sense? Like if you look at the formula for glucose, which makes up cellulose, it's C6H12O6. So you got the H's, you got the O's, you got the C's. That's where that stuff's coming from, okay? All right, so those are effects you need to think about on nutrients. Part 3 of ecosystem ecology. We're going to go through a plant review real quick. C3 plants. C3 plants are most of our normal plants that are grown around here, and they, my hair's like that. What happens every turn of the Calvin cycle with C3 plants? What do we get out of it? You go through the Calvin cycle, we get one. What?
It's like half of the carbohydrate.
What? G3P, very good. G3P is half of a glucose molecule. It contains how many carbons? C6H12O6. Half of that would be? 3 carbons. That's why we call it G3P. And that's also why we call them C3 plants. 3 carbons come out with each turn of the Calvin cycle. Those are most of your normal plants. C4 plants. C4 plants have an adaptation called the bundle sheath to prevent what? In dry climates, it prevents water loss by preventing what? Well, it prevents the plant from dying.
Evapotranspiration to the stomata.
No, but what does it prevent inside the plant that can kill it? That happens when the stomata is closed.
Like too much oxygen?
What's that called? When you use oxygen in the place of CO2?
Oxidation?
Nope. Prevents photorespiration, where you lose carbons through the Calvin cycle and you're not replacing them if your stomata are closed. So the Calvin cycle can only occur, remember, in the bundle sheath. And because of that, it only lets CO2 in, so it prevents photorespiration. So it's another adaptation for drier plants. And the other plant that's not mentioned here in review, the cam plants, what do?
They
Open their stomata at night, take in the CO2, convert it to some kind of acid. During the day, they convert it back to CO2. And in doing so, they prevent water loss during the day. That's like your friendly cactus. All right. Transpiration occurs through the stomata. Stomata is usually found on the underside of leaves. Lets water out. Let's what else in? CO2. What else does it let out? Oxygen. What type of plants would you typically find most of the stomata on top of the leaves? What? No.
trees.
There's a few on top, not many. Like 95% will be on bottom. Tree leaves. What plants would most of the stomata be on top? They don't really have leaves. I don't know where theirs are just probably all over their little stems and stuff.
I forget what they're called, but flowers that only like bloom at night or something.
Lily pads. Why would lily pads and water plants like that have their stomata on top? Because they're in the water and they couldn't exchange CO2 and oxygen because there's not much in the water. So you would need that on the top side. They're also not worried about water loss. So you can have those jokers open all the time, yeah. So, something to consider. Work on y'all's thinking skills. Maybe y'all can redeem yourselves. All right, harvesting food. This is going to be a one-day lesson on apes here, and at the point we're at now, it's going to be about a half-day lesson on apes. So, harvesting food promotes loss of nutrients. What do farmers do in the Midwest and north of where we live, because we don't have many farms like this? What do they do to prevent nutrient loss?
They rotate crops.
Like, okay, so what are the two main crops that are always rotated? Almost always.
Corn.
They grow corn one year and then they grow soybeans the next year. Soybeans are a type of legume, legume, which means they have what growing on their roots? Bacteria in a symbiotic relationship on their roots. Those bacteria help to which nutrients in the soil? This is on the data nugget, for the love of God. Nitrogen. They have symbiotic bacteria on their roots that are putting nitrogen back in the soil. Legumes, beans, peas, kudzu, some other stuff. So, what does corn use a lot of? Nitrogen. Corn depletes the nitrogen, soybeans help to replenish it. You don't have to fertilize as much, you don't lose as many nutrients. Okay? Fertilizers. We talked about excess fertilizers and excess runoff of waste causes eutrophication, cultural eutrophication. You don't want that. So a good way to prevent that is not to put so many nutrients in that could run off when it rains. Fossil fuels. Acid rain is bad. Good. There's two types of acids, nitric acid and sulfuric acid. Now, it's really bad in areas like up north where it snows because you have acid snow that builds up. It warms up outside. A lot of that melts and flows into your friendly lake or pond, Matthew, and causes what to happen? A dramatic change in from the top, makes it drop. pH, yes. Makes that pH drop fast, and what happens then? People die. No. Aquatic organisms. Because those aquatic organisms, they need a fairly stable environment. It's much worse than just if it's rain, a little bit of acid rain every now and then, because it's slight increments. When you have a massive amount flow in at once, like with a snow melt, then you can have what's called acid shock, and then you have a die-off of aquatic organisms. All right, another effect, acid precipitation. If the soil the more acidic the soil, the less plants are able to absorb nutrients, okay? So unless you're a blueberry bush, a strawberry, or like potatoes, the main ones I can think of, unless you're one of those jokers, you normally like a neutral pH soil. Because if it's too acidic, you're not able to absorb the nutrients. Nutrients get leached out, they get pushed down and away from the soil, and you don't do well, okay? So acid precipitation can be bad for the soil as well. Let's turn over to 1271. On 1271, have y'all heard of Rachel Carson? Yeah. I know you people over here on this side of the room have. All right, Rachel Carson, she wrote Silent Spring. Somebody decided to make a chemical called DDT and kill all the insects in the world along with half the other stuff. Now, what they didn't know, speaking of like we were talking about vaccines and what we don't know, they didn't know early on that DDT levels can not only kill insects, but it could also build up and be harmful to other organisms. DDT is also very persistent. Its half-life is 30 years, so this joker sticks around forever. So biological magnification basically means as you go higher up in the food chain, levels get more and more concentrated in organisms. So I'll give you some examples. Some bad things that you normally hear about biomagnification. PCBs. These were used in plastic insulators on like electrical wires. GE dumped like millions of pounds of this stuff in the Hudson River that goes past New York City. You couldn't drink out of there if you wanted to or eat a fish out of there. We have PCBs in fish in East Alabama. You're not supposed to eat them because of PCB levels in some streams and rivers. Mercury buildup in many organisms, especially like fish in the water. So there are a lot of fish advisories around here for fish you are not supposed to eat, primarily larger catfish and largemouth bass. In Lake Tuscaloosa, in the upper and lower portion, you are not supposed to eat any largemouth bass because of mercury. Did y'all know that? Mm-hmm. Well, you people did. In the middle portion of the lake, I think they said you could eat like 2 meals of it per month. I don't know. That's of biggest concern to the pregnant ladies and young kids. So remember that, Walker. Now there's a if you ever want to know if you can eat a fish out of somewhere, there's an Alabama Fish Advisory report online. Look it up. It's got it for almost every stream and creek in the river in the state. Now, let's say you're an eagle, Ashlyn. Okay, how many fish are you going to eat a day? 5, good. So you're going to catch 5 fish a day. Those fish have been swimming through the water. They've been getting DDT or mercury or whatever, PCBs, as they swim through the water and swallow it. They've got a little bit in their tissues, okay? A lot of these are fat soluble, meaning it kind of hangs out in their fat tissue. You eat them. You eat 5 per day for a year. How many are you getting, Matthew? Almost 2,000, good. So because you're eating a bunch of them, even though they don't have enough to be really harmful, because you're eating like a couple thousand of those a year, that chemical is building up in your tissues, okay? Now, DDT caused the demise of the bald eagle. For what reason? Messed up its eggshells, good. Y'all don't remember anything from last year. Come on now. So basically what happened is that buildup of DDT caused the shells to be really thin. When they laid on the shells, Ashlyn, you're laying on your baby egg, and it cracks, and you cry, and your babies die, and then you die without any offspring or progeny to continue the line. And you know why? Because somebody thought it was a good idea to spread DDT everywhere and kill all the mosquitoes. Was it worth it? So now we see a return of bald eagles pretty recently around here in the South. But it took a while. That was banned in 1972, Walker. Keep that in mind. So as you go up the food chain, it gets more and more concentrated as you're eating a lot of these smaller things that have a little bit, you get more and more of that. Does that make sense? Yummy. What's the next one? CO2 levels. Turn to page 1273. On 1273, there is a graph. This graph is on the test, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's on. Now, this is CO2 levels in the atmosphere. CO2 is a greenhouse gas, which corresponds with temperature. Why in the world does the CO2 go up and down every year? Okay, this is from Hawaii. Okay. So, what time of year is it going to go up? Summertime. When does it go up?
Winter.
In the northern hemisphere, it goes up in the winter. Why? CO2 levels go up in the winter because there's not as many plants with leaves consuming CO2. When would it go down? Summertime, because plants are taking in more
CO2.
Genius. Now, in the southern hemisphere, it would be the opposite. Yummy. Dang, you are good. Keep that in mind. Let's look at the ozone layer on 1274. 1275. So, ozone. Why do we need ozone? What?
Protect us from the sun's rays.
Protect us from those sun's rays. Yes, some of y'all definitely need that. Quit laying out trying to get the skin cancer at the beach. You know who you are. All right. So CFCs were another man-made molecule that we managed to use that kills ozone. And one CFC can destroy up to 100,000 ozone molecules. That's a killer right there. Now, we stopped producing CFCs in 1984, 7, somewhere in there, I can't remember. But CFCs are still a problem because they can hang around in the atmosphere for up to like 50 years. So they discovered this hole in the ozone over Antarctica. And basically, this joker got bigger and bigger, and hopefully we see some recovery in the future as the CFCs in the atmosphere break down. But we did a job on the plants and animals that have to endure that extra UV light in the southern hemisphere.
Have we seen any so far?
That's a good question. I don't know. I haven't seen any recently.
I think
It's going down some. So I think it was, I want to say it's 87 that they signed that. So what are we, 35 years in or so?
Just like the US though, or?
Well, in the U.S., it's not really bad. Where it's really an issue is like in the southern hemisphere. And it is thinner in the Arctic over the northern part, but it's not a big hole like it is in the southern hemisphere. And it gets worse. Here, I can't remember. Don't ask me to explain this. You'll have to look it up. It gets worse in the Antarctic spring, like the first of the spring into the winter. So for some reason, after it's been cold for a while, it gets worse. They react. Normally, we think of things reacting more when it's hotter. But I can't remember the exact mechanism there. You'll have to look that up.
Isn't like most countries ban those?
What?
CFCs?
Yeah. It's like supposed to. There was a big. It's called the Montreal Protocol. All a bunch of countries got together and banned those jokers. All right, and the last thing, species extinction, where we're right in the middle of a big extinction because of
Climate change.
climate change. Probably has some extinction effects. The biggest cause of extinction is,
Rising temperatures.
he said climate change,
No, but
habitat destruction.
Overhunting, overconsumption.
Yeah, habitat's the big one though. When you destroy and displace where organisms live, then they don't have food to eat or places to live, and then they die. Yes, hunting's a contributor. What'd you say? What else you say?
Overconsumption.
To consuming too many, like fish. Take care of the environment.